Good morning, everyone. My name is Anshul Pande. Super excited to be here. I'm with the Fellows Fund. I'm also an EVP and General Manager with HealthEdge. And with me is Zach. Zach's the CTO with Abridge. He's also a fellow. And quite a journey Abridge has had. I was deeply impressed with what you guys have done in a very short period of time. Among the things that have happened in the last 10 years that have impacted healthcare in a big way, interoperability definitely, a lot of work that has gone on in terms of patient engagement and stuff. But the one thing that has stood out is the work you guys have done to make the provider experience amazing. And with all the stories we had heard about burnout, this is one technology that I can definitely say from personal experience, talking to my own physician, is that makes him excited about coming back to healthcare day in and day out. He's going to bed earlier. He is not taking his laptop after dinner to finish his notes. So really life changer in terms of how the provider is experiencing it. So thank you for building that out. Tell me a bit about how this all started. Like, you're an AI researcher. You did your PhD, and we're doing some incredible work. But what brought you into healthcare? Because there were so many other problems that you could have looked at, and healthcare is super complicated.
Hey everyone. I guess I actually developed my interest in healthcare before becoming an AI researcher. It was actually kind of all tangled up together. So in my early to mid 20s, had my own kind of period of dealing with an autoimmune kind of situation, and I'd been a musician at the time, so that was how I was spending my time. And it's, I think there's some parts of medicine that are kind of miraculous. Like I don't know, my mother had a leaky heart valve and they sawed her open and went in and exactly repaired it mechanically and put her back together, and now she's just fine. And there's other parts of medicine where it feels like we're kicking the vending machine, hoping for a different outcome. And I think autoimmunity is if you want a place to look and feel frustrated, maybe one of those where, I think a lot of a couple conditions that are studied really well, and then a bunch of other people just hoping to get the hand-me-downs of oh, that drug seemed to work for them, maybe it'll work for us. And so you're trying to navigate what is known, and you're in a universe where back of the envelope, maybe 10,000 people, maybe 40,000 people are engaged in a certain kind of off-label use. And then you look to the literature and try to say what's the what's the results, and you see oh, here's a description of 3 cases over here, and here's a description of 10 cases over here, and here's a bunch of guesswork. And so, I mean, for me, I was at this point in my mid 20s. I hadn't been pre-med. I was a math student at Columbia previously, and I'm frustrated with the health system, and I'm looking at what seems to be a bunch of problems, and part of it is institutional, who can access what data for what purpose. And there's a bunch of tangled up, there's things being proprietary, there's legitimate concerns about privacy. There's a question about systems, just has anyone engineered the right computer systems for storing and sharing this data securely? And then there's fundamental methodological questions, even if you had all the data in the world, what's the magic query that you would write that would tell you the answer, give you actionable information, and causal inference is fundamentally a hard problem. And so I didn't know that much, but it felt to me I thought about well, what are the routes where now that I'm kind of frustrated and I kind of feel well, this is what I want to do with the next chapter of my life, is have some impact. How do I do that? And one thought is maybe I try to become a kind of physician researcher and try to do an MD PhD, but I'm thinking if I start med school and then do an MD PhD, I'd probably still be in grad school right now. And so the other opportunity, way of thinking about it was I had some semi self-taught programming skills and a background in math and statistics, and was thinking now it seems kind of obvious maybe in 2025, but in 2012 it was maybe a little less obvious that machine learning might be a route to do something interesting in healthcare. So I applied to a bunch of programs. I cast a pretty wide net. I had 0 research experience, but it was slightly less competitive then. And I got lucky. Charles, actually, who's in the audience, is my PhD advisor, and I think like indexed heavily on maybe having. I think Charles had a bit of a pragmatic bent and problems, and I had a research statement that was very like, this is how I see machine learning. I was very naive about the machine learning and maybe very determined about the healthcare and at least somewhat organized in that thinking. I think Charles took a chance on me. And so that's why I got into AI research. So I always like kind of had maybe one foot more like fundamental machine learning methodology, whether it was like, techniques for building and training neural networks, or even a little bit more on the like stats theory side about like representational power of certain kinds of neural networks, or like statistical advantages of certain types of like data collection techniques, or conditions under which models could be robust under distribution shift. But I also had one foot that was like firmly like collaborating with clinicians and applying technology on real data. So like I built during my PhD the first neural sequence models for electronic health record data, built systems for computer vision systems for helping like embryologists in the fertility clinic. So like they didn't have to spend all their time manually labeling individual frames of like when does an embryo reach each stage of like, and when so I was like kind of doing a lot of work on a lot of sides, got a professorship at Carnegie Mellon, offered about 4 years into my PhD, and they don't have a med school. So when I came there, it was like I knew I was coming to a school with a strong computer science department and with no inside the four walls medical collaborators. And so I was looking externally for like who could I work with at UPMC. And that's how I met Shiv Rao, who's the CEO of Abridge. So it was like very early on, like even before I started as a professor, like during my house hunting trip, I met Shiv and we started talking. And that was how I got my first grant that funded my lab. But also a few months later, like the earliest conversations that ultimately led to the founding of Abridge.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I think that the personal journey with some of the things that you dealt with from a healthcare perspective definitely brings a mission and a purpose behind what you're doing now. That is amazing. One of the interesting things is that the first work that you did with Shiv was really around getting to what is probably the most sacrosanct part of the relationship between a provider and a patient, and that has always been something that has been deeply covered in privacy. So not only did you take a very hard AI problem, which is listening to a conversation, analyzing it, and then extracting nuggets from it at a very, very high fidelity, but also it is deeply covered in privacy and stuff. Like we had a hard time, even back in my days when I was writing software, to be able to get this permission to be in those conversations where the physician as well as the patient were actually ready to let you into these discussions. So how did you think about that among all the problems in the world, even in healthcare AI?
Sure. Yeah, we had this, right, there's first a recognition that, hey, if you were in the conversation, there's a huge opportunity here. If you had all that context at your fingertips. And then the question is like, well, how do you get in the conversation and how do you actually build the technology that makes good on that opportunity? In terms of like what made us think we can navigate the privacy concerns, we were looking at it from a few angles. So like on one hand, like 2018, the technology to be able to take an entire conversation anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and turn it into like tightly structured notes was still a bit far off. That was deep in research land. Like no one would even dare to think that like they could build anything remotely passable using off-the-shelf tools, because like your language models at the time looked back at like a context length of like 200 words, and we were these conversations could be 4,000 words, 10,000 words. As to like so like on one hand we're working on the R&D side. The other side we were looking at like how do we get inside the conversation. And one thing that we got inspiration from was initially we hadn't figured out the go-to-market. This is very, very, very early. We hadn't figured out, is it going to be, we knew that there was value to be delivered to providers. We knew there was also value to be delivered to patients. And it wasn't obvious like who would be the one to bring us into the conversation and how would we form the connective tissue. But one thing that gave us a little bit of inspiration was that patients, there were a lot of these articles that were coming out like with something like the patient will see you now and like type titles, and they were addressing this phenomenon of among other things, patients were already, with or without the doctor's consent, in a strikingly high fraction of encounters, making cell phone recordings of their visits. And this was a phenomenon that was already happening and was already on the radars of hospital system executives. They were doing it for a lot of reasons. I'm sure there were a handful of like people that were just like kind of looking to gotcha, and they were like malpractice hawks or whatever. But I think a lot of people were doing it mostly for innocent reasons. Like, a lot of stories like, hey, I usually come with my spouse, and my spouse has more wherewithal and they can't come today. So I'm recording this visit so I could share it back. Or maybe it's their child that's their caretaker. Or it's just like for their own reference, like they kind of most things go over their head. And so there was already this like normalization of this as like, whether or not it was something that doctors had consented into or was being done with just like kind of one party consent, it was a thing that people knew about, and all like the risk was already there. And so that created a window of opportunity where actually a lot of hospital system leaders were thinking, well, if 40% of the encounters are already being recorded, I'd rather that we actually have the entire recording, and worst case scenario, if anything were to happen, we have the record. So I think like that climate, the fact that through natural forces, maybe not in the exact form of the product we imagined, that recording was already taking place. I mean, another important thing is that like remote scribing was taking place. So we already had some comfort with there's a recording and there's someone on the other end. It was just a human. And in some sense, the risky part of that is the recording. And the recording is taking place either way. So I think the fact that sometimes AI causes people to look at something familiar in a new light, kind of like science fiction. It's like, but the thing that's actually striking isn't always the part that's new. It's just that like you're suddenly like, wait. I think it's true of a lot of general concerns about privacy and AI, including on social media. I think a lot of what scares people about privacy when they talk about social media and AI isn't the AI, it's the, oh, wait a minute, like Facebook knows all that about me. So.
No,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. I think it's super fascinating that in healthcare, what you mentioned about needing a care coordinator or a care advocate with you is so important, because it is complex terminology that you're being explained. It is stuff that you have to do over a period of time, and as you look at folks with multiple comorbidities or multiple issues going on, it's not an interesting or easy regimen that they could follow. So having that more additional information, whether it was recorded or available after the fact, becomes important. The other interesting thing that I saw which your technology brought in was something the physicians have been asking for a very long time, especially research. With the way we have built healthcare in the US, a big focus was on billing. And so the documentation was focused really on how do you bill for the service versus can I get rich history from the patient? Can I get the adjacencies from the patient that I had in the discussion, and then have it available in the charts for future research? So I think those are the things that you brought in amazingly with your technology by bringing in front and center. All right, let's move on to a little different portion of the conversation. AI has changed how you have built teams. And tell me a bit about that. You're a CTO of a fast-growing company. How have the team structures changed from a technology perspective? What do the teams look like when you started the company, and then how have they evolved as you've grown?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on right now. I kind of, when I first got a taste of industry, machine learning tended to be really siloed out from product groups. Right. Both from an org design perspective, like in terms of like as seen on the org chart, and also from a team structure standpoint. And I think maybe
data science was an after fact. It was like on the side. It was not connected.
It was either there's data science with the more analytic flavor, which was an after the fact, but then there was like machine learning, like prospective work, but it was still kind of siloed. I think it was, you had people like doing like at institutions like Microsoft Research or Google Research, where it just like lived in its own building, and and it created like a kind of culture that I think was not good for building technology, which was that like the most, I think there was a long period when I was at Microsoft Research, it was like the mark of a good manager was that they shielded their employees from having any contact at all with product. And that was how you knew that you were on like a strong research team, is because they contributed nothing back to the product. And I also had a period in career where like my goal was to like write academic papers and that were in a certain lane and position myself for a faculty position. Like that was the perfect place for me to be, and like I treasured those summers. But I think it's also not a great climate for like in this world where there's a much more dynamic loop between the model development and what we ship. I think it's just so much faster than anything we imagined before. So another thing that's happening is that I think there used to just be these two lanes sort of, which was like there were people building models, and the people building models need to go out and collect, absurd amounts of data and engage in a very long process of model development. And then eventually like you have a new model. And then on the other side, there was like product development, which had its own kind of rhythms. And now you actually have these things in the middle, because like you're developing like new fundamental base models, but you also have like these tighter post-training loops. And then you also have like the side of model behavior adjustment, which has a flavor of machine learning, because like you're changing behavior of intervention, but it proceeds in a much faster cycle because it's relying on things like context engineering and prompting and kind of like agent building and orchestration. And when you start looking at like that spectrum, now there's a lot of weird kind of blurred lines of like when I look at that kind of behavior, is that an extension of the AI org? Or is that what like 50% of product engineering is going to be 5 years from now? And should you be thinking about that as just like, that is what product engineering is, and just you need to AI pill the entire product engineering org and just embed them top to bottom. And that's, I think, a trade-off that a lot of us are facing. Like the advantage of putting them in there is to say, like, that's where I think we're all going, and those are the skills we'll need. I think the downside is, I think it's actually, we're in this weird time where there's a lot of product capabilities where the only way to build them is to train a new model. There's a lot of product capabilities where actually like you could power an interesting feature and give an AI-powered delighter entirely through prompting off the existing models that you already have at your fingertips, whether proprietary or third party. We're in this weird inverted phase where like the hard part is often evaluation in those spaces, where you still need people who have a kind of a certain repertoire of statistical thinking, not for like kind of coaxing the model into a kind of behavior, but for verifying that, how often does it actually do what you wanted it to do? And so that's where I think you then start thinking, well, do you engineer that in the org, or do you engineer that in process? Like, hey, anyone can build an AI-powered feature, but there's a controlled process for what it looks like to ship, and a more centralized set of gatekeepers who own the tracking and evaluation of AI-powered features. So I think this is kind of like the spectrum that we're all on and navigating with.
That's spot on. I think that's definitely a challenge in terms of figuring out how much can be done without creating your own models with what's available, and then how far does it take you, and whether how far it takes you is enough to ship a product or not. And it's not a straightforward answer in terms of making that decision. And sometimes you got to take it as far as you can and realize, no, wait a minute, this is not good enough, and we got to build our own models behind it to be able to take it further.
Yeah, there's also a lot of stuff where you can build something and it's like, there's stuff where like it's not good enough to ship. There's other stuff where like it's good enough to ship, and also we can continue to improve it and do better. There's also stuff where it's good enough to ship, but the way to build it with a sort of naive reliance on like kind of third-party foundation models is some absolutely absurd token guzzling mess that is not computationally efficient, so that it's a great proof of concept that we have the right product pattern and people like it, but it's taking too long and it's costing too much. And so I think in those cases, there's a kind of life cycle of a capability where you prototype in a more like built on top of the foundations, and then you have a fast follow once you've established the fitness of that feature with a kind of like much faster, lower latency, lower cost distilled model that is developed by your machine learning teams.
That's a great point. So allow them to play even if the cost is high, if they can find a product market fit and then optimize it in a subsequent step.
Yeah, like if you could show me that you could build something that's truly transformative experience with like 12, Claude calls that are woven together in some monstrous way. If you could show me that you actually have built the right feature and that it actually, from an evaluation standpoint, is safe to deploy and effective and works, I'm 100% confident that we could build that same feature, 1 year later with like 1/20th the cost in a single model call or two with a proprietary model. And so at that point, there is a certain amount, and I think everyone's in this world to some extent of like, it's weird. Like, how do you, as like from a business brain, look at like the current gross margins versus like future. Understanding that like that cost is not, the cost side of the equation is not something that is static, and it's so much more important to be delivering the right product to people than to be like worrying about something when you know that even for the existing models, the cost is just going to fall precipitously as there's just like advances all the way from the chips up through to like hyperscaler pricing.
Wow, that's amazing. One last question. What are you most excited about next coming from Abridge? And where do you see healthcare going with AI?
Sure. I think there's, I think we've always bristled at the, like, I think there's a lot of VCs like to put you in categories and like, these guys over here, this is a coding company, and these guys are the scribes, and these guys are whatever. And I think, we never thought of ourselves as just the scribes. I think what we thought of is that there is this, that there's something truly special and magical about serving physicians at the point of care. And that if you're at the point of care, like kind of so much of the important work either like takes place there or could take place there. And it's like what you needed was just ears and like an AI workforce capable of carrying it out. I think we're at that moment now of transition between Ambient being thought of as primarily scribing, and Ambient as a more kind of like fundamental and comprehensive kind of platform that supports clinicians at the point of care. And as we, so much, I think it was important in the initial phases that we be non-interruptive and that we proceed kind of cautiously. And I think we still don't want to interrupt, but I think we're at a moment now where instead of just being kind of like quietly listening in the background, and like only at the very end of the visit do you then kind of see anything at all, to provide a kind of more dynamic real-time experience that kind of becomes like your magic clipboard. Like for example, we're tackling prior authorization right now. And like, I think an experience that we'd like to have is not that you conduct the entire visit just guessing about what would be the particular checklist that patient's payer is using to assess like whether or not to approve a treatment, but to be at the moment that you mention the procedure, your AI agent's kicked off in the background, has already talked to the payer, knows for that patient, with that flavor of the plan, with that employer on that payer, this is like the approval criteria they're using, has put it on the screen and already checked off the criteria that have been met based on like the record to date in your conversation. And it's showing you like, this is the question that like you need to remember to ask so that you don't have to like jump through a bunch of hoops for paperwork like later on, 2 weeks, 2 months later. So I think like that movement from like sort of like after the fact is where the AI magic happens to a more dynamic real-time experience, like a more fully fledged co-pilot that like while still not interruptive is sort of at your fingertips, it's there for you whenever you look down. I think that transformation is what we're going to see in the coming months and years, and what I'm super excited to build.
That is awesome. That's a world I'd want to be part of. Thanks, Zach, for building it, and thank you very much. This was awesome, and we'll pass it on to Renee.